What is happening in Washington right now, it does not look like normal politics. It doesn't even look like the new normal we've grown accustomed to over the last decade. No. What happened today looks like something much more rare and much more consequential. It looks like a rebellion. And for the first time in this presidency, Donald Trump did not just encounter the usual partisan resistance. He didn't just run into a no from across the aisle. Today, he encountered a full-scale structural revolt from inside his own house, from inside his own party. Less than 3 hours ago, a gavel came down in the United States Senate, and while that sound usually stays within the four walls of the chamber, this time the echo carried all the way to the Oval Office. The vote was not close. It was not one of those down-to-the-wire nail-biters. It was not ambiguous. It was decisive. It was an intervention. The United States Congress just stepped in to stop the President of the United States from launching what can only be described as a scorched earth economic assault on our closest neighbor, our biggest trading partner, and our literal next-door neighbor, Canada. You have to understand what the president thought he had here. He thought he had the ultimate weapon. He announced a 25% universal tariff on every single product crossing that northern border. Everything. He was certain he had the leverage. He was certain that Canada, faced with the sheer gravity of that threat, would buckle. He expected a surrender. He expected them to do what he's seen others do: capitulate. But he didn't count on Mark Carney. Mark Carney did not surrender. He didn't go on TV to scream. He didn't engage in a Twitter war. Instead, he did something much more dangerous to the president's agenda. He methodically, piece by piece, dismantled the president's entire strategy from the inside out. And now, as we sit here tonight, the consequences are cascading. They are cascading through the halls of Washington, and they are ripping through the financial markets simultaneously. The White House is scrambling to find their footing. Trading floors are seeing red. And for the first time, a question that was previously unthinkable in the current GOP is being asked out loud. Is the president losing control of his own coalition? Tonight, we're going to take you through exactly how the math changed today. We're going to look at the leverage Carney deployed, the specific Republicans who finally decided to break ranks, and why, even if you live 1,000 miles from the Canadian border, this vote tonight just protected your household budget from damage you would have felt in your wallet by Monday morning. At exactly 2 p.m. Eastern today, the United States Senate did something that has not happened in decades. They passed a bipartisan resolution that, quite literally, strips the president of his favorite tool. It removes his authority to impose national security tariffs on Canada without the explicit permission of Congress. Now, why does that matter? It matters because, for years, Donald Trump has treated a very specific, very obscure part of American trade law like a personal easy button. It's called Section 232. It's a national security provision. In theory, it's meant to protect the country in times of existential threat, to ensure we aren't dependent on adversaries for things like steel or fuel during a war. But in practice, for this president, Section 232 has been a personal cudgel. He decides a country has displeased him? 232. He wants to force a concession on a totally unrelated policy? 232. No consulting Congress, no seeking legislative approval, no institutional check. And last week, he tried to do it again. He demanded immediate concessions from Ottawa on border policy, on dairy access, on energy. When Canada said no, he pulled the trigger. 25% tariffs on everything: oil, cars, steel, lumber, agriculture. It was all scheduled to go live this coming Monday. But then came 2 p.m. today, and today, Congress took that button away. They didn't just pass a suggestion, they passed a veto-proof majority. Republicans and Democrats stood together and said, "Not on this, not with this neighbor." Look at these numbers, because the numbers tell the story of the shift. 74 to 26. In our current political climate, getting 74 senators to agree on the time of day is a miracle. To get 74 votes on a direct rebuke of the president's signature trade policy, that is a seismic event. And here is the most important part. 25 Republican senators abandoned their president on a vote where he had explicitly, publicly demanded their loyalty. These weren't just the usual suspects. These weren't the moderate Republicans who always push back. No, these were senators from deeply conservative states. These were senators who depend on the president's endorsement for their very survival. These were people who have stood by him through every other storm. So why did they break today? Because they looked at the math. They looked at the data for their home states, and they realized something terrifying. They realized that while the political cost of defying Donald Trump might be high, the economic cost of supporting him was going to be a catastrophe. One Republican senator from the Midwest was overheard leaving the chamber, and he put it more bluntly than any political analyst ever could. He said he simply could not sell a recession to his constituents just to prove a point. That is the calculation that drove this vote. It wasn't about a sudden change of heart. It was about fear. Not fear of the president, but fear of what the president's actions were about to do to the people who actually vote for them. But here is the thing. The intelligence behind this outcome? The strategy that actually forced the hands of those 74 senators. It didn't originate in Washington. It didn't start with some secret caucus in the Senate basement. It originated in Ottawa, and it happened over the course of the last 72 hours. While the headlines were focused on the president's rhetoric, Mark Carney's team was doing something far more quiet and far more effective. They were in direct communication with every significant governor, every key senator, and every major business leader in the states most vulnerable to a Canadian trade disruption. They didn't issue threats. They didn't make emotional pleas for friendship or allyship. They presented data. They sat down and they showed precisely what would happen to the economy in Ohio if the border closed. They showed exactly what would happen to manufacturing in Michigan. They showed the math on energy costs in Pennsylvania. And the math was devastating. We now know that American auto manufacturers, the literal backbone of the industrial Midwest, sent a letter to Senate leadership. It was signed by the CEOs of 3 major car companies and 5 major energy corporations. And the language in that letter? It wasn't diplomatic. It was explicit. They warned that if those tariffs went live on Monday, assembly lines in Michigan and Tennessee would cease operations within 48 hours. They warned that fuel prices in the Midwest would spike by 40 cents a gallon, literally overnight. They put it in writing. This is not a negotiation tactic. This is a supply chain collapse. And sources now indicate it was Carney's team that provided the analytical foundation for that letter. They understood something the White House missed. They understood that the American business community had reached its breaking point. There's an image circulating tonight from Ottawa, and it tells you everything you need to know about how this was played. It shows Carney in a strategy session with his trade ministers. The table is covered in maps. But they aren't maps of Canada. They are maps of American congressional districts. They had identified exactly which districts would absorb the most damage, districts the president needs for the upcoming elections, and they ensured that every single representative in those districts understood exactly what was coming for them. This wasn't diplomacy in the traditional sense. This was precision political engagement. While the president was swinging a heavy, blunt object, Mark Carney brought a surgical instrument to the fight. When a reporter caught up with Carney today and asked if he was worried about the president's reaction, he didn't even slow down. He just adjusted his glasses and said quite simply, "The math works for us. I hope the president checks his calculations." The fundamental question we have to ask tonight, the one that political scientists are going to be picking apart for a decade, is how a president who rebuilt an entire political party around the concept of personal loyalty suddenly and so spectacularly lost control of his own Senate. How does that happen? The answer lies in the mechanics of the trap the president actually constructed for himself. You see, for years, the president's negotiating approach has depended on what strategists call the Madman theory. It's the idea that if you project enough volatility, if you convince the person across the table that you are unpredictable enough to actually pull the pin on the grenade, the other party will calculate that surrender is cheaper than confrontation. And look, that approach has produced results for him in the past. It's generated concessions from nations that looked at the chaos and decided that compliance was easier than resistance. But here is the thing about the madman theory. It depends on one critical load-bearing assumption. It depends on the target having no viable alternative. It only works if the pressure is so overwhelming and the options are so limited that submission is the only rational choice. And what Mark Carney did this week was eliminate that assumption systematically. When the president threatened those 25% tariffs, Carney didn't respond with a loud press conference or counter-threats. He did something much more effective. He released a list. But it wasn't just any list of American products. It was a targeted, surgical list of American exports that Canada would restrict in retaliation. And he ensured that list included specific products manufactured in the home states of the most politically influential Republican senators. He didn't just target America. He targeted Kentucky bourbon. He targeted Texas electronics. He targeted Midwestern agricultural equipment. He made the political cost of supporting those tariffs personal. He made it specific for the very senators whose votes would determine whether the president's policy survived. And while he was doing that, Carney was conducting an outreach campaign that bypassed the White House entirely. He wasn't calling the Oval Office, he was calling state governors. He was talking to corporate executives. He was talking to labor union leadership. He presented a consistent message. The president is about to inflict damage on your economy. Here is the math that proves it. Here is what you can do to prevent it. And here is how Canada can help if you help us. It was a level of strategic sophistication that Washington was simply not prepared for. Usually, when Canadian leaders come to Washington, they arrive seeking approval. Mark Carney arrived with leverage, and he deployed it with the precision of someone who has spent decades understanding exactly how economic systems respond to pressure. That is the contrast that explains today's result. The president operates on instinct and spectacle. He sees a problem and hits it with maximum force, expecting the impact to produce compliance. Mark Carney operates on systems analysis. He identifies the pressure points, he calculates which actors have the actual power to influence the outcome, and then he applies exactly enough force to those specific points to get the result he needs. The president wanted to win a news cycle. Mark Carney wanted to restructure a relationship. And today, the structural approach won. Now, beyond the high-stakes political drama in the Senate, let's talk about what this actually means for you. Because the implications for ordinary people on both sides of the border are immediate. They are tangible. If those tariffs had activated on Monday morning, the cost of lumber for home construction would have spiked by roughly 20%. Gasoline prices, already a pain point, would have spiked. Grocery costs would have risen. And why? Because Canada is the largest supplier of energy to the United States. Period. You disrupt that supply, and the consequences don't take months to arrive. They arrive at the pump within days. But beyond the immediate economic relief of this vote, there is something much larger happening here. This vote represents a fundamental shift in how international relationships function when the traditional leader, the United States, becomes the source of instability rather than the guarantee of order. For 70 years, the United States has occupied the central position in the global economic system. We set the rules. We established the norms. We provided the stability that allowed international commerce to function predictably. But look at what happens when the president of that system begins behaving erratically, when allies can no longer predict whether agreements will be honored, when tariffs are imposed and withdrawn based on an emotional reaction rather than a strategic calculation. What happens is that the system begins to reorganize. It begins to find alternative centers of reliability. What Canada just demonstrated today, and what Mark Carney just proved, is that a middle power can successfully resist American economic coercion. And you can bet that every capital on Earth is currently taking notes on how he did it. European leaders are watching. Asian economies are evaluating the implications. Every nation that has ever worried about being targeted by American trade pressure is processing the lesson that Carney just taught. And the lesson is this: resistance is not just possible, it can succeed. The president intended to project overwhelming, unchallengeable strength. Instead, he inadvertently revealed that his power has limits. He revealed that when the economic consequences of his actions become severe enough, his own coalition, his own party, will step in to restrain him. And he revealed that a strategically sophisticated opponent can take his own tactics and turn them against him. But don't think for a second that this is over, because as we look toward the next few days, we are seeing three very different, very dangerous trajectories starting to form. So, where does this go? Because if there is one thing we know about this president, it's that he does not take a public rebuke like this lying down. As we look at the coming days, three very specific trajectories are forming. First, there is the administrative retaliation. Congress may have taken away the tariff weapon, but the president still has a lot of tools in the shed. He can order enhanced border inspections. He can slow down commercial trucks with new regulatory hurdles. He can create massive amounts of friction at the border without technically violating the Senate's resolution. If you are crossing the border next week, expect delays. That is the small ball version of this fight. Second, there is the legal confrontation. There are already whispers that the White House will challenge this congressional action in court. They will claim emergency authority that supposedly supersedes anything Congress tries to do. That fight would drag on for months. It would go to the courts, and it would create a cloud of uncertainty that the financial markets, which hate uncertainty, will likely react to very poorly. And then there is the third trajectory, the strategic retreat. This is the one where the president announces that productive discussions have taken place, claims credit for concessions that may or may not exist, and drops the tariffs while declaring total victory. It's the rational path. It's the path that saves the economy. But it's also the path that requires a capacity for tactical withdrawal that this president has very rarely shown. Right now, his public communications suggest he is choosing escalation. He is attacking the senators who voted against him. He is promising primary challenges. He is behaving, quite frankly, like a wounded political figure who interprets an institutional check and balance as a personal betrayal. And Mark Carney? Mark Carney is watching. Those strategy sessions in Ottawa? They haven't stopped. The analytical teams mapping out American congressional districts? They are still at their desks. Because Carney understands that while the first battle may have been won today, the underlying dynamic remains. A leader who governs through intimidation will always go looking for a new target. But here's what really changed today. The world shifted. It didn't shift through a military strike or a dramatic summit. It shifted through the mundane, boring mechanics of legislative procedure. It shifted because 74 senators decided that economic stability for their own people mattered more than personal loyalty to a single man. Mark Carney just proved something that is going to be studied in diplomatic circles for a long time. You do not have to be the biggest power in the room to win a fight. You just have to understand the systems that connect us. You have to identify the pressure points where economic reality turns into political consequences. And you have to have the discipline to apply that pressure with a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. The president brought volume. Mark Carney brought mathematics. And today, mathematics won. The president is diminished tonight, but he is not defeated. The coming weeks are going to test whether the guardrails that held today can stay standing against a leader who has spent his career trying to knock them down. What happened in that Senate chamber this afternoon wasn't the end of the story. It was the establishment of a new boundary. And for the first time in a long time, the relationship between these two nations isn't defined by the assumption of American dominance. It's defined by the reality of mutual dependence. And mutual dependence requires respect. Mark Carney didn't ask for respect. He earned it through results. And those 74 senators, they didn't vote today because they suddenly fell in love with Canada. They voted because they realized that the alternative was a self-inflicted economic wound that no amount of political loyalty could justify. That is what leverage looks like when it is used by someone who understands how the world actually works. And that is why tonight, the balance of power on this continent looks very different than it did when the sun came up this morning.